So that's what we're going to talk about today, Scope 3 emissions. I have with me Adriana and Stamatia. So good morning, Adriana. Good morning, Stamatia. Hope you're great.
Hello, Carlos.
Thank
I
you.
know that you have a lot of materials ready. Adriana is going to be starting this call, helping us understand what is Scope 3, why is it relevant, and different dimensions of it. And then I will be talking a little bit on the data that is needed to gather to report this on this Scope 3 emissions. And finally, Stamatia is going to help us understand different concepts of what is a life cycle analysis, what options do we have in the market, and finally, how to make all this complex world easy for you. Because I think this is the name of the game. The Scope 3 is difficult, but it has to be easy for you to act on it. Why? The why you want to act on it. Let me explain it in a very simple sentence. A lot of regulation is coming, and you're going to need to report Scope 1, 2, and 3 emission. Not only the European Union taxonomy, but a lot of other pieces of regulations are already in place and are around the corner. Now, before handing it over to Adriana, there's one thing I want to clarify, because we are going to be talking about data in this episode. And let me explain very briefly what kind of data we're talking about. The first thing is very easy to understand. There are sources of data that you will have within your organization and outside your organization. Those are primary and secondary data. And the beauty of this is, what if as much information as you can have control, it is within your company? That is the secret sauce of Scope 3 emissions, having as much information as you can, okay? Now, there is not always the possibility to have information about every different detail. You can aggregate it at different levels about the products you are manufacturing, about the activity you're in, about your facilities, about business units, about the whole corporation. It doesn't matter. You need to have data at different levels, but don't worry if you don't have data at all levels. It's something that you can build little by little. And then another concept that I want to help you understand is that you will not always have data on everything. You have different approximation methods. For example, you can do average, or you can do proxies. Proxies is when you don't have the information for that activity, but you have information about a similar activity. Or you have what it's called the EEIO, so environmentally extended input output. For example, for a sector, for activity, you know that for 1 million euro of revenue, you are emitting X tons of CO2. So there are different ways to have approximation to data. And what you will learn in this call also is that how you combine accurate data with non-accurate data. Don't worry, we're going to hold your hand, and to start this and to take off, we're going to have Adriana explaining what is Scope 3.
Thank you, Carlos. So just to share also a bit of context for maybe listeners who are not that aware of what is Scope 3. So you mentioned basically it's emissions which is not in the direct control of the company. So this is divided also in upstream activities and downstream activities. If you can share that slide that I have, basically there are 15 main categories. Thank you. On this kind of Scope 3 emissions, covering both upstream and downstream. And you can see there it's starting with purchased goods and services, but also moving to capital goods, fuel and energy, transportation, waste, business traveling, employee commuting, and even going to things like processing of sold products, use of sold products, and end of life. Yeah. So it's also about thinking the entire product life cycle of something that we are producing. But why are these Scope 3 emissions that important? They are very important because basically we have seen through measurements which are produced by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol that these are often the largest source of emissions. So only focusing on Scope 1 and 2 is not enough. They are not the most significant ones. You can see here there are in general around 80% of the other scope 1 and 2. And we can also see that most of the times scope the downstream one are usually larger in this example. So scope 3 emissions are very important, and Greenhouse Gas Protocol has produced a reporting standard on that. You have seen we have taken some information from them already. And in order to produce that standard, they have been working with more than 2,000 participants from over 55 countries. So there were 96 members participating in technical working groups to draft the standard, and 34 companies from various industries which road tested the standard actually in 2010. Yeah, so this standard is out there for a while now. It's 10 years back. It was released in 2011. So moving back to the next slide, there are some barriers, as you might imagine. Since this is not in the control of a company, it needs to collaborate with all the value chain, as you might imagine. And this comes with challenges. There is lack of transparency because most of the times providers don't want to share that, or they just don't have it. And not only, sometimes it's difficult for them to provide that. There is a lack of resources and also a lot of know-how around that, because it needs a lot of knowledge in order to calculate it, to gather the data, and a lot of stakeholders are involved. And there is also lack of relevance and benefits, because if you cannot involve all your stakeholders and you cannot measure it, you cannot also understand what is the impact of the things that you are doing to reduce it. And again, it's also sometimes difficult to influence the way that your partners are working and to cooperate with you. But the good news is that there is, like Carlos said, good news or bad news for somebody, for some people, is that a lot of regulation is coming, which will make things mandatory. So it will simplify a lot the availability of data. This means that, for example, we have the non-financial reporting directive, which has been there since 2014. But now the European Union, for example, is working on what is called the corporate reporting, corporate sustainability reporting directive. Sorry, so many names. And this has been already released as first proposal this year in April. And basically, this will be extended. So the NFRD will be extended to companies which have more than 250 employees, a balance sheet of over 20 million, or turnover of over 40 million. So this means that also a lot of medium-sized companies will get in there in the scope of this directive. And of course, it will be complex for some of them, but for them it will be simplified. Yeah, so they will make things easier for these smaller companies, and they will also have reporting standards which are easier to comply with, and they will have a bit more time to do that. But the good news is that if they will start to do that and share their data, there is going to be more cooperation, more transparency, and we will be able to handle these barriers. You wanted to say something, Carlos?
No, I don't, but I think it's a good opportunity to clarify that when you know that there are already some regulations and there are some other coming, and especially for some sectors, whether you are in the construction sector, or if you're in electronics or textiles or furniture or beer, beverages, you will need to report a lot and to audit a lot and to track those data until the source. So that intelligence and that complexity has to be solved somehow. And I think one of the things that we're going to do in this call is hold the hand of the people that is listening to us, and not only present, okay, these are the needs, these are the regulations, this is what Scope 3 is about, but this is how we can help you solve this with best practices. So let's continue hearing from you, Adriana.
Yeah, I think one important thing also to mention here is that these emissions will become another dimensions for measuring and decision making. So if you think about what are my providers, what are my raw materials, where I should buy it, you should not think only about price and quality and if it does the job that you need, but you should also think about the emissions that you are getting when you buy those things. And if we look at how relevant are Scope 3 categories in different sectors, we see that in most of them, purchased goods and services are very important. We can see the blue one, yeah, it's repeating a lot, and also the green one, which is use of sold products. But let's talk a bit more about purchased goods and services, because I think this is the thing that most companies can start with. It could be easier, but it could be also more complex. So if we look at these, what are the main barriers in this area, and we can move to the next slide here. There are specific barriers for handling purchased goods and services, also renewable electricity.
Adriana,
Yes.
so to make sure that everybody understands, remember the scope 3 has 15 different categories, and you're drilling now into the first one, which is purchased goods and services, correct? Okay, let's go
that's right. Thank you. And the reason why is because, like explained before, it turns out that it's one of the most important ones for most of the sectors. So one of the first challenges that we are facing with purchased goods and services and renewable electricity is the accounting challenge. How to calculate these scope 3 emissions. And Carlos has already talked about this. You can use primary data, so data that you have directly from the source. But if that is not available because of lack of transparency, lack of accuracy, you can use also secondary data. One important topic here is that secondary data is great for looking at your hottest points. Yeah, so where is your most scope 3 emission sitting, in which category? This is very useful. But once you understand that this one, a certain category is the most of your scope 3 emissions, and you want to work on reducing that, you should start using primary data, because otherwise it will be impossible to understand if you are making progress or not by just doing estimations. Second challenge, and
so,
again
so
to
that
the slide.
That means, Adriana, that if you're using, for example, an industry average that is not your real data, you don't know how to improve it, because next year you will continue using the industry average. However, if you have your own data in the first year and you do some activities to reduce your emissions, then next year you will use a different number. So that's what you mean?
Yeah, that's right, Carlos. Thank you for clarifying. So this way you will be able to measure the progress you are doing. The second challenge is also how to measure the impact, how to account for the benefits of the actions that you have taken. And again, this comes to the same thing. If you are only using estimations, how can you know what's the impact of what you are doing? How can you get the return of that? It's hard. And the third one, if you can move to it, please, on the next slide, is how to find the most effective approach to reduce emissions. So once you have identified which are the hottest points, how you can take the best approach to reduce these emissions. So as far as it regards purchased goods, this means that, of course, you need to collaborate with your providers, with your suppliers. So understand what are they doing to reduce their emissions, collaborate with them, cooperate with them. This is a network game, like Carlos always says. You cannot do it on your own. Your suppliers need to be on that journey with you, and they need to understand the why and what is the impact and how you can collaborate better. Because, like I was saying, price and quality of products will not be the only dimension to make decisions. Emissions will also add in there. So very important to collaborate with them, launch green supplier programs, work together to get primary data, take actions to reduce them, and understand what's the impact of reducing that. And the fourth one is related to renewable electricity, which is again very important. It is needed in all sectors. You need to push renewable electricity procurement in the supply chain, because this will reduce definitely all the emissions all over the value chain. So we have seen some barriers now, but let's talk a little bit about some solutions, even though we kind of already talked about some of them. There are also some solutions, and GHG protocol, it's apart from the reporting standard, it has also created guidances on how to measure data, what is the best approach, and how to overcome these barriers. So first of all, I would say you need to map the value chain for sure. So you need to understand what is the list of your purchased goods and services, what are all your partners from all the value chains, so suppliers, transportation partners, logistics, investment banks, and so on. get a list of that, get a list of all the products that you are producing and all the activities. Then you need to look at your boundaries. Yeah, so understand which are the most relevant scope 3 activities. And here we have some guidance from GHG on how to what criteria you can use. Yeah, so what is the size of the activities, how you can influence them, what is the risk for you, what are your stakeholders wanted to look at, and so on. And once you have that clear, of course, you need to start collecting the data. And here, of course, this is not easy, like we were mentioning before. And here we have different ways to do it. Use primary data or use secondary data. But Carlos and Samatia will talk more about what kind of data we can use when it comes to secondary and to primary data. Once you have collected the data, of course, you need to calculate your emissions. If you have primary data, of course, this might be easier because you already have the numbers. If you have secondary data, there are different ways of doing it. Like Carlos was mentioning, using averages, using industry benchmarks, but also using more complex mathematical models like Leontief, for example, inverse matrix, where you can use productivity coefficients to understand the emissions of your tier 1 suppliers, but not only your tier 2 and tier N suppliers emissions, which are hard to get usually. So this is very useful to understand all these tier 1, tier N emissions. And of course, it has some mathematical models behind it in order to calculate it. It's still an approximation. Yes, Alice.
Sorry, I just want to do 2 comments on this slide because I think they're important. As you mentioned, these are recommendations from GHG on what to report in Scope 3. So that's one of the things that regulation is going to change. It's going to go from being recommendations to being mandatory in many cases. So the sooner you act, the better on gathering data. And then another thing, this is a very personal view, but if what differentiates primary data from secondary data is not where those data are coming from, is where are those data. So for example, you can have from your ERP, you can collect a lot of information. For example, how much money you're paying for electricity. You can collect that from your ERP, okay? But if you have systems to have control over Scope 3 emissions in your systems, that's also primary data. Let me put you an example. Imagine you use Concur for traveling. You have all those Scope 3 emissions in your system, so for you, that's primary data. Imagine you use Arriva for sourcing. You have those, and your suppliers are providing, of course, Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that's primary data for you. So the secret sauce is I am going to convert a lot of things that are normally secondary data into primary data because I have the systems to go and fetch those data directly. I think that's one of the, when we are talking about solutions, that's one of the recommendations. Convert secondary data into primary data by owning and controlling the systems. And if you can have more sources, I mentioned Concur for travel, or Arriva for purchases, or Qualtrics to talk to your suppliers or to your final customers, and of course your ERP. That conversion from secondary data into primary data is one of the secret sauces of Scope 3 emission control.
Thank you, Carlos, for that comment. Very useful. So going back to our slides and how we can overcome the barriers, once you calculate your emissions, of course, you should prioritize your opportunities to reduce the GHG emissions and collaborate with your value chain partners in order to do that. And there are also opportunities, there are also solutions to look at the priorities that you have in reducing these emissions. And if you can look to the next slide, again, in the GHG protocol reporting standard, there is also a framework to assess these reduction opportunities. And you can see here that there are some things which will cost less and some things which will cost you more. but they will also come with different advantages. Some things will come with lower reduction and some things will come with higher reduction. So you should choose your battles, yeah, and depending on the investment that you would like to put and also in the impact that you will get with those reductions, you should understand where you should put your efforts in reducing these emissions. So moving now back to Carlos and Stamatia, maybe to share a bit more insights on primary and secondary data.
Excellent, Adriana. Thank you very much. I love that. You should choose your battles in abating Scope 3 emissions. So let's go for it. Let's dig a little bit deeper on that. So let's look into some images to drive the conversation. This is something that that we have. It's been shared by Adriana, but there are so many Scope 3 emission sources. Let's identify that the ones that are bigger, the ones that have more influence. But I want to concentrate on the fourth dimension here, the ones that are important for your stakeholders. We meet a lot of customers that are doing some very good things for sustainability, but they are not thinking yet on what their customers really want them to act on. And if they think about it, the most logical thing to do is just go and ask them. Go and ask them, hey, Mr. Customer, what do you want me to do in terms of reducing my emissions? So a stakeholder opinion, and that's what we do at SAP with Qualtrics, it's very, very important to understand which are the battles that I have to choose, going back to what Adriana was talking about. If we move on to the next image, what we have is, no matter how you do it, if you have direct data from your suppliers, and we can put together this green program for suppliers, so we give them some time to adapt to new legislation or to give us data. But if we put together this green provider programs, sometimes we will have information from them. Sometimes we will mix that information with averages from the market. Sometimes we will have zero information from them, and then we'll say, hey, Mr. Provider, you have 6 months to adjust, or I will look for alternatives. So we have to put a program in place to do this transition from full data to no data. Because I can tell you something, this is a journey. So data improvement over time is the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is not, I'm going to have all data for Scope 3 emissions from the very beginning. And that's why regulation also gives us some time to adapt, okay? So it is easy, don't worry. We just have to choose our battles correctly. If we go to the next image, what we see is that for each one of the 15 categories in Scope 3, there are always also some very clear methods and very clear calculation of how to do the numbers. Don't worry, it's not science fiction. Most of the methods are as simple as that. You have activity data, let's say liters or kilos, and you multiply that by an emission factor. How much kilos of CO2 that liter or that kilogram produces. The result of multiplying one times the other is your GHG emission. And then you add all your GHG emissions and voila, you have your final result. It's not science fiction. You just need a small amount of data at the beginning and then increasing your data over time. And you will see also how much satisfaction you get when you're able to report and your competitors are not able to report, when you are able to connect to your customers and tell them, hey, Mr. Customer, I'm the first company that complies with these criteria. I'm the first company that complies with these legislations. I'm the first company to be able to use some labels. By the way, we have new regulations in the way to determine who can use which labels depending on what kind of reporting they do on Scope 3. So all this is easy. It has a lot of paybacks for you as a company. So let's move on and let's understand a little bit better now. How can we bring this to fruition? We explain the complexity, the different sources. There are many systems out there. I'm just going to mention one from SAP, which is called Profitability and Performance Management. And what we have done, if you go to the next image, is we have just sketched which are the different SAP systems where you can gather the data from. I was talking about Concur and Ariba and the ERP, of course, S4, and environmental health and safety, but also non-SAP systems. How can we gather this information? At least you have a good percentage of the information as primary data. And then what is the secondary data? How can you start that journey to make it easy for you? And to make sure of one important thing, this is not ready to comply with one legislation, although EU taxonomy is embedded and TCFD is embedded, etc., and of course GRI. But it's good to comply with any regulation that may come because you have the granularity, you have the power of the data, and you have that data access to all different sources. So I'm about to finish here, but I want to give you a couple of extra messages. The first one is in the next image. And what it's telling us is, okay, it will not be enough with your primary data. It will not be enough with accessing your provider's data. You will have to go and get some averages, to get some external data, secondary data sources, and those are LCA data. One of them, all of them, by the way, or the most recommended one, around 50 of them are listed in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol webpage, and some of them are specialized in different sectors. For example, if you are in construction or if you are in beverages, some of them are generic and cover many different industries or products. One of them is EcoInvent, because we'll talk about it in detail, because we're integrating this LCA database in that connection to our SAP systems, and Stamatia is gonna describe it a little bit more for us.
Yes, thank you, Carlos. As you mentioned, the life cycle inventories are databases to collect secondary data. EcoInvent is one of these. There are approximately 50 to 53 already posted in Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Most of them are following the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but not all. There are some that they are not following this protocol. And also, except from the industry, let's say, specializations of those databases, also some are covering specific regions, specific countries, and there are some others that are covering, that they have a global coverage, let's say, that they are covering a wide range of countries and regions. EcoInvent is one of these. It is a global database. And for example, they are providing, EcoInvent, for example, is providing regional or global average greenhouse gas emissions factors, total CO2 equivalent and emissions factors for separate greenhouse gas emissions, some environmental indicators, average transport distances, specific information on product and technology mixes, and regional waste and disposal mixes. So these are some things that databases that EcoInvent are providing. And I will give a simple example that was also mentioned in our sustainability summit in some days ago. They talk about a product. So let's say that you have an apple, and this apple, you would like to calculate the CO2 footprint of the apple. So what EcoInvent or similar databases will give you, it is the data that has to do with the pesticides, fertilizers, electricity mixtures, and you can use those data that you get from the databases like EcoInvent so as to put them in your manufacturing processes. So how those life cycle inventories are connected with the Lifecycle Assessment LCA. So those databases like EcoInvent are embedded in the LCA software applications. So, and what is an LCA? LCA, life cycle assessment, it is a standardized methodology that evaluates the impact of your product or your services. For example, it gives you how much sustainable is your product. And second, enables companies and different stakeholders to make decisions about the environment and their strategies. LCA methodology requires, as you can understand, a lot of calculations. That's why we have a number of tools and softwares, we call them LCA softwares, that are doing those calculations. And except from the LCA softwares, there are also some different, like social LCAs that has to do with the social part of the sustainability. And which are those 5 main phases of LCAs? And there we will understand also where EcoInvent and LCIs are connected. So in the phases of LCA, we start first with the goal. So a company should first identify the scope and the goal. For example, what do I have to measure? I have to measure how sustainable is my product, is my services. So the goals should be clear. Second, it is to understand the life cycle inventory. And here is where the different LCI inventories, for example, like EcoInvent take place. So those databases, LCI databases, are the backbone for LCA. So LCA is taking those data from LCI and use it so as to collect all the data together. The third phase is the impact assessment. We call it life cycle impact assessment, and evaluates the impact of your assessment, evaluates how sustainable is your product, and somehow structures your data. And the fourth layer is the interpretation, where you take into consideration and you check if your calculations are correct, if they're taking consideration of the ISO 14040 and many other things that you should take into consideration, so as to take your product and put it into the market. Now, another thing I would like to mention very briefly, and it is the next slide, is who will be valued by using an LCA assessment, life cycle assessment in the company. Of course, it is the R&D at the first phases of creating and designing a product. Second, it is the procurement and the supply chain management, as with LCA, you're evaluating their suppliers. And then it is the marketing and sales, because using LCA, you can identify how sustainable is your product, and then how to communicate it into the market. And last one, it is the management, so as to avoid risk and take the correct strategic decisions.
And I think this list of beneficiaries of using LCA, it's the same one that the beneficiaries of using Scope 3 emissions reporting.
Of course.
So that's good for research and development, that's good for customers, so marketing, that's good for the executives. And let's not forget one thing. If the money that corporations can get in financing, the green money is going to be, and is already, by the way, much cheaper if my operations are green. So all the efforts that I do to report on Scope 1, 2, and 3 are going to help me report on my activities and access the green financing that is available from the European Union, but also from many different countries. So also from a financial point of view, it is essential that we understand LCA and its repercussion on Scope 3 emissions.
Yes, great point, Carlos. Another thing that it is interesting interesting to find out during my research is the 5 steps of a product life cycle, and how LCA is connected to circular economy. So the 5 steps of a product life cycle, it is what you can see on screen right now. It is from cradle, that means raw materials extraction, materials manufacturing, to gate, that means product manufacture use states, to grade, it is the end of life. So you can use the LCA methodology from cradle to gate, that means from the extractor of the material till it reaches the factory. From gate to gate, that means inside the processes of the manufacturing. And from cradle to grave, that means from the extractor to the disposal. It is a data-driven strategy. If we go to circular economy has to do with the reduce, reuse, and recycling. You can also see it in the graph where those 3 goes. So LCA is a data-driven approach, and as we can understand, circular economy, it is mainly spiritual approach. So if you combine LCA methodology with circular economy, then you can get a holistic approach. And I found it really interesting to find during my research. And I don't know if we have the time to mention some things about the different industries and how.
One comment if I can make here, Stamatia, is I love the way you connected it to the circular economy topic, which I think is very important as well. And also, we talked about collaboration with all the partners outside of a company, but I think you showed that it's very important to have a lot of cooperation inside the company. So procurement, sales, marketing, research and development, everything needs to come together and work on gathering Scope 3 emissions and collaborating externally to reduce it as well.
Of course. So let's go to the industries. I have found some graphs that illustrates the 15 categories that also Carlos and Adriana mentioned, and how much they are impacting each one of them, the environment. For example, in the 8 that are in the upstream sector, we can see that business travel and produced goods and services are impacting most. And those that are in the downstream area, the use of solid products and the downstream transportation, they're impacting the environment most. So if we go to the next slide, we can see an emissions breakdown by sector. So this was from a scientific report that was published in 2020. They used a sample of 866 product carbon footprints in 145 companies, 30 industries, and 28 countries. As you see, the graph is sorted left to right by increasing average carbon intensity. We can see that computer IT and telecommunication has the most increased carbon intensity, and this is mainly for the users of the data centers and all these that requires a lot of energy. So in red, we can see, so if you can keep the graph, in red we can see all the emissions that come from upstream, in blue from downstream, and in gray from direct operations. And we can see that packaging for consumer goods has more emissions in the upstream area, while automobiles and components have more emissions in downstream, and construction has more emissions in direct operations. So we can see that the emissions 3 are different in per industry and per sector. According to those findings, also we found out that if we can have the slides again, because I don't remember the numbers by heart. We can find that the 45% of total value chain emissions arise upstream in the supply chain, 23 during the company's direct operations, and 32 comes from downstream. So, and if you go to the next slide, we can see, you may think that this is a busy slide, but actually, if you check, the blue shows those that comes from upstream, the green those that come from downstream, So we can see that industries like food and beverages, professional services, retail, pharmaceuticals, and textiles and footwears, all of these have more emissions on the upstream area. And industries like oil and gas, mining, automobiles, electronic equipment, and aerospace have more emissions on the downstream part. And this shows also again, and it is also a slide that also Adriana showed before, that it also again shows that each industry reports on their emissions differently. Any
Excellent.
comments from?
Yeah, I was just going to say, of course, durable products have more downstream, and non-durable products have more upstream. And for example, something that you eat, the moment you eat, it disappears. You don't have to care too much about the usage of that product, the end of life. However, in a car, you will have that car for 10 years, for 12 years, for 14 years. So for those companies that they don't want to be impacted negatively by the long duration of their products, because of course they emit more scope 3, because you have that product for more years and using that product for more years. What they do is they focus on the intensity emissions. So emissions per kilometer that you drive, or per year that you use, or per hour that you watch TV, and that's the way they handle it. So thank you very much, Samadia, for those insights. So if that's okay for you, I want to thank you, Adriana, Samadia. Great insights, great contributions. I learned a lot, and I'm going to leave you with 4 thoughts about scope 3 emissions and what is important. The first one is you need data, a lot of data. You need data federation capabilities, and we saw that that's a process. Don't worry if you don't have all the data. It is a journey. It's just making sure that you go to the most important places first, and that you try to have as much primary data as you can have. The second one is that you need this allocation capabilities, cost allocation capabilities. You need to make sure that those all greenhouse gas emissions you allocated to the right products, to the right activities, to the right EU taxonomy. We've seen there how life cycle analysis and other tools can help us understand how to do the right allocation. The third message is you need to do a scenario building. You need to know what happens. You need to steer your company, not only having those data to report, but to steer your company. So those scenario building capabilities, what if it's crucial for all companies to enable those. And last but not least, you need to be able to report on any different standard. Don't box yourself to a particular standard, no matter if it's the trending topic or not. You need to be open. You have to have the granularity to report, to comply with any regulation that is up and coming. If you have these dimensions covered, data federation, allocation, scenario capabilities, and reporting strengths, then you're going to be able to shine with your scope 3 emissions reporting. So with that, I want to thank you again, Adriana. I want to thank you again, Stamatia. We don't have... Bye.
Bye.
Bye.